My name's Alan. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer. I've been working for about 30 years, coming up to my anniversary soon. I still enjoy teaching very much. I've been mostly in Hastings in the south of England, but I've been to Vietnam, Egypt, Indonesia, Brazil. Very enjoyable teaching and training trips.
A question I was longing to ask you is, how would you describe your lesson to someone who hadn't seen it?
I gave my students a lecture about making decisions, and I broke the lecture up into little bits, and between each bit they had the chance to check out with their friends what they'd heard, and then to tell me what they'd heard. And then we explored the vocabulary in the lecture a bit. And then they talked about the topic.
So what about this topic, this particular topic? Were you sure it was going to work?
Well, it's worked before. And it seems to strike a chord in people because most people are making decisions of some kind. And the idea of making decisions by throwing the dice is bizarre for some people and therefore interesting to talk about.
You chose to do this by using yourself as the source of the listening,
Yeah.
A kind of live listening. Why did you choose to do the listening in that way?
Well, it's more real. There's more possibility of interaction. So I say something, there's a response, I respond, there's a sort of a dialogue about it. It's also probably got what I'm doing now, ums and ahs and ers, and it's more natural sounding. And I think using cassettes, I used cassettes a lot when I started teaching, and I find that students find them very difficult and not terribly interested in doing them sometimes.
So have you stopped using pre-recorded material?
I use them much less. Much less than I used to. I like to rely on myself more, which sounds a bit egotistical, but it seems to be more natural.
A number of times in the lesson, students had the opportunity to kind of reconstruct what they'd heard to make sure they'd heard it correctly. Why did you get them to do that?
I think it's quite useful for students to go through this process of trying to figure out and remake something that they've read or heard. There's a whole reconstruction activity. I think it makes them pay attention more to the language that's in there. And when they get, maybe eventually they get the missing bits, I think those missing bits have more impact when they receive them.
Because they're listening more carefully for them when they come around the next time?
Maybe, and the first time around they're aware that there's something that they haven't got and they're kind of hungry for that. And then, as you say, maybe the second time around they listen more, or they see it and pay more attention to it.
Hi, I'm Barbara. I work in Cambridge. When I started teaching, I was a volunteer. I went to India before I went to university. I really enjoyed that. So after university, I went to Spain for a year and taught there. Then I decided to come back to the UK and become a qualified teacher and make this my career. I've been teaching for nearly 20 years now. I'm a teacher trainer. I train newly qualified teachers, and I've started training teachers who are developing their careers a little bit further.
What was the main objective of this lesson? What did you want the students to get out of it?
It was an integrated skills lesson, so there were two main objectives, and that was to listen for gist and then to listen for specific language that they could use in their speaking. So there was a speaking objective and a listening objective.
How do you think the lesson went?
I achieved my aims, which was to have the students speaking using the phrases they'd heard from the listening. I think I could have developed that more, and on reflection I might do that lesson over a longer period of time next time. I think the things I would like to develop more were using the tape script and listening a little bit more intensively to catch the phrases, the target phrases that we wanted to use. The other thing was exploring what happened after those phrases, what language was used, you know, whether it was an infinitive or a clause or whatever. That could have been quite helpful, but the students seemed to grasp that from the example because they had the context and the tape script. So it went well. Next time I might develop those things more.
Why did you choose to use an interactive whiteboard for this lesson?
I chose it because I think it has huge advantages in the classroom. I'm using a digital version of the course book that my group are following, called Cutting Edge. And I particularly like the listening in it because you can just touch the screen and bring up a very high quality listening.
Some critics of the interactive whiteboard worry that it sort of reinforces the teacher's position at the front of the classroom, that it focuses all the attention on that end of the classroom and takes it away from the students and from communication. Are you sympathetic with those criticisms?
No, because I think students find it really helpful to use it. For example, they can come up to the board and drag things across to match them. They can create presentations which look fantastic on the interactive whiteboard, and they're very proud and have ownership of that. I think that there's better interaction in the classroom when you have a picture, for example, that you want the students to talk about instead of a scrappy photocopy or heads down in a book. We have one picture up that's very clear and students can talk, and the interaction is much better with the heads up. So I would disagree with that. Also, the advantages are you can listen to a short piece again by just touching the screen, or you can bring up the tape script, highlight a key phrase or word, touch that, and you just hear that again. So it's really reinforcing the listening for the students and getting them and giving them access to difficult passages in the listening.
In your lesson, it seemed to me you used the listening as a way of getting towards your final task, of getting students to talk about irritating rules or rules that irritate them.
Yes.
Is that something that you often do? Do you often use listening in that way?
I do. Listening is very valuable to students. It's one of the hardest skills for them to acquire, I believe. And I think they should be exposed to listening as much as possible. Reading is easier because they can go back and see it again. So I want to make listening a focal point for my students. I like to even give homework, listening homework, because I think it's so valuable.
When you set up an activity, what are the most crucial things to bear in mind?
I think to keep your own language, the teacher's language, simple. So instead of our very polite British way of, would you mind possibly, to be very direct, open your books, avoid embedded questions. I also think it's important to give instructions step by step rather than a whole string of instructions that students have to remember. So for example, if I'm doing a mingle activity, I think it's important to get the students into the middle of the room first, then deliver the next phase of the instruction.
Rather than trying to give the instructions at the same time as they're all running around and getting in a mess.
Or while they're sitting down and then they have to remember what they have to do. I find that more effective and the lesson flows better.
My name's Bill, and I've been teaching English as a foreign language for over 25 years now. I also work on teacher training courses, mainly the CELTA, which is initial training. And my particular interest, I think, is working with lower levels and working with intonation.
What was your objective for this lesson?
I'd call this a dialogue frame. It's something I do a lot with elementary students, where you work with familiar language, clearly the adjectives and the what did you do last night were familiar, and you put it together in a frame. So you've got 6 lines, question, answer, you build it up, and then you work very carefully with how you say it. So the language is familiar, but what I think these students didn't have was clear focus on how you say it. And I worked with that very carefully. And then they got into their own choices where they could have dialogues, and then they just personalised it and talked about that. So the end point, you could argue, was them using that dialogue framework to talk about their own experience, but focusing very much on how they say it.
Do you use dialogue frames with students at all levels, or is it just for students at around the elementary level?
Much more with elementary, where they're just coming to grips with basic tenses, and therefore they feel very comfortable. It's kind of scaffolding, so that for an elementary student this must be terribly rewarding to be able to work with new language and use it in a fairly meaningful framework, and then they move on to use their own choice, their own personalised choice of language.
What do you mean in this context by scaffolding?
Scaffolding, I mean, giving them, they've already got it's already familiar language, so they've got the basic adjectives that are used in that and the basic past tense, but they'll slowly build it up so that it's supported by board work, by teacher modelling, so that they're not suddenly thrown into using this dialogue without, another word for scaffolding could be support mechanism, where they're slowly led into that until eventually they go and have their own dialogues. So whichever metaphor you choose, support, framework, scaffolding, they all fit, I think.
You spent quite a lot of time in this lesson working on stress and intonation. Is that something you do a lot?
I think I do, because students can learn basic tense formation from a book. I think something that we bring to the classroom is giving life to the language and focusing on, particularly, as you saw in the extract there, how you say it. So you focus on where's the main stress and what's the intonation and is it rising or falling, so that it's a recognition phase and then they produce it, which I think worked in the lesson. It was quite effective.
How much do students get out of an intonation session? Do they learn intonation? Is it recognition we're after, or perfect production? What is it, do you think?
I think it's both. I think there is a strong element of recognition, and when they can then tune into the system and for me, it all hangs on where the stress is. So I constantly asked, which is the stress syllable? If you find that, then the intonation will hang on that stress, and then, as best they can, they produce the utterance.
A lot of teachers fight shy of intonation teaching. Why do you think that is?
Well, I've been working with intonation for 20 years, and I'm still sometimes confuse myself as to the actual pitch direction, so I can sympathise with that. My advice would be work with where the stress is, get the general feel for the pitch direction, and then you can help your students. I think most of the students could hear it, partly because I exaggerated it, and when they actually practiced it, I think they were pretty accurate.
When you're teaching pronunciation, especially stress and intonation, do you use repetition a lot?
Absolutely. I've been teaching for a long time, and the generation that I trained with, we use drilling an awful lot. And I think when I'm doing in-service training or pre-service training, one of the techniques that I try to get over to learning teachers is the technique of drilling, and it's very powerful. It can be overused, but choral drilling, for example, where you've got a very tight model, the students will chant it once or twice for the feeling of the stress and the rhythm, is very powerful. And as you saw in the video, I then moved very quickly from that into across the room, question, answer. So, but there was a lot of repetition. So going back to the scaffolding issue, I think this meant that the learners were really safe when they actually went into their private little dialogues. They'd already had lots of safe, comfortable repetition practice with me controlling and me supporting them.
Hello, I'm Ellie. I've been teaching for about 26 years. I've taught in Scandinavia, Central Europe, and more recently, I've been teacher training in the Middle East. I've got some particular interests, one in teaching younger learners, teaching pronunciation, and in general teacher development.
What were you trying to achieve in that lesson?
It was a very, very accuracy-based lesson. Now those students are, some of them are real beginners. We don't often get real beginners any longer for obvious reasons. You know, it's a world language, English. So most people who come here as beginners, they will be false beginners or people who've had some exposure. The disparity between somebody who's a real beginner and somebody who's a little bit better is very noticeable. And although some of those students could produce this language fairly well, some of them were very, very inaccurate. So this was a lesson where I was trying to keep them all on board. It was very, very accuracy based. We've already looked at going to future, but they're very, very, very inaccurate. So that's okay sometimes, but in this particular lesson, I wanted accuracy. I wanted to be very, very demanding with them and for them to see all those bits of that language.
In your lesson, you're very careful about the way you model sentences. You use your fingers to show stress and words and things like that. Why are you careful in that way about how you model sentences?
You will probably have noticed that I didn't put the language on the board to start with. I think this is more demanding. It's an option to put it on the board straight away. But I think it's more, I use the word demanding again, or challenging for the learners. If they hear it, what they're doing is they're hearing the language as it's spoken, and then don't write it down, hang on, listen to it again, and as I show them the words, they can see the language in their mind's eye. So those learners who perhaps are more visual, let's say, have the opportunity of seeing that pattern in their mind's eye before they see it written down. So I suppose I'm trying to appeal to different learning styles perhaps there.
What's special about teaching beginners? I mean, particularly in contrast to teaching intermediate students or advanced students?
In terms of methodology, there are obviously less opportunities for things like pair work and group work. Whereas more advanced students can put them in pairs, they can speak for quite a while, and you can have a speaking lesson which might even take half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. They can stay the distance. But with beginners, of course, despite the fact they haven't got very much language, they can do a little fluency work, but very often the focus will come back to the teacher again. So it's quite demanding in those terms. Of course, if you like to be an upfront teacher, then it's very nice teaching beginners.
And what about the kind of language you use with beginners and more advanced students? So how do you choose the language you use, or is that something you do automatically?
I've been teaching for a long time, so I think it is an automatic thing, but yes, it's a good question. Obviously, one has to be very, very careful not to use colloquialisms in instructions and to use lots and lots of body language to support instructions. You can use natural language, you don't have to go into pidgin English, but it needs to be supported with lots of mime and lots of gesture.
The way you talk to students, talking naturally to beginners, not using pidgin English, is that something you learn how to do, or is that something that just comes naturally with experience?
I think both. yes, it comes like everything comes with experience. You get better at doing it, but I think it's something that you can learn. I'm a teacher trainer, and when I work with teachers who are taking an initial training course, typically one of the criticisms will be you speak too much and the language you're using is too complex. And often I'm asked the question, well, what do I do about that, Ellie? How can I stop that? And my answer to that is just stop. I think if you just stop babbling, it's a pejorative word, but if you stop babbling and just listen to or think before you speak and become more conscious of the language you're just about to produce, then that's the first step in reducing the amount of language you use and noticing more what you're saying and then noticing what the students are saying.
But of course the language teachers use to beginners, I mean outside the actual models they give, that's terribly important for their acquisition of language, for them to listen to language. So it's quite important that teachers do talk to students.
I agree. So it's like what Krashen called comprehensible input. As long as we make it comprehensible to them. And certainly I think that teachers need to avoid distorting the language just because the students are very low level.
By speaking too slowly or
by speaking too
terribly woodenly.
Exactly,
or something like
exactly,
that. Yeah.
yes. I mean, the risk is then patronising the learners. We don't want to do that.
Hi, my name is Kit. I'm a TOEFL teacher. I've been teaching for 9 years now, 2 years in Poland, a year in Italy, and since then here in London.
Kit, what were your objectives for this lesson and what did you want the students to get out of it?
Well, mainly to learn some useful expressions for directions, which would be particularly relevant for them actually staying in London. So, you know, they have the chance to use them in the real situation, in the real world.
At the beginning of the lesson you explained what you were going to do in some detail. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. Do you always do that?
I do. It's signposting the lesson for me helps me to keep it on track, and it also provides a sequence for the students so they can see that there's some logic behind what they're learning. The other thing that's quite useful is using that as a tool for consolidating the lesson afterwards, actually referring to the points on the board and saying, well, what do you understand by this point? You know, when we say asking directions, can you give me some examples? So, you know...
It's a very good summarising.
It's something I started doing a couple of years ago. You know, I actually learned, well, I watched another teacher doing it and thought it actually seemed to work quite well. And so I did it.
At the beginning of the lesson you dictated a whole lot of questions to the students. So why did you dictate the questions rather than, say, just giving them the questions?
Well, first of all, it provided listening and writing practice for them, but also helped to actually keep the students engaged. The questions were actually in the book, but I found from experience that it's often a good idea to dictate it to keep them engaged. I also think that dictation often helps in a kind of learner-trainer. Well, there's an element of learner training to it. I ask the students to look at each other's questions and actually start the process of learning how to kind of correct their own mistakes, rather than relying on the teacher to actually do that all the time.
Do you normally teach coursebook-based lessons, or was that untypical?
Certainly in London, you know, we use a course book to underpin the course. I think course books are a very useful resource for teaching, but obviously after a few years of experience, you realise that there are certain strengths that you have as a teacher to modify the course book in some ways. In a sense, that's what the dictation was for me. It was modifying the strengths of a book with my own personal strengths, really.
Hi, my name's Laura. I've been a teacher for about 7 years. My first job was at a school in Ascot working with young children, and then I went to Poland where I taught children, teenagers and adults, and I worked there for a year. And then I came back to London and I've been working at Embassy CES School in London for about 6 years now. It's a great school. We have a really good mix of nationalities. It's interesting. And in the future, I think I'd like to go into teacher training, but we'll just have to see where that goes.
What was your objective in the lesson we saw? What did you want the students to get out of it?
Well, the main objective was to sort of set up a role play and then for the students to get involved in the role play. So I suppose for them to get out of it is an opportunity to practice speaking